Hi everyone. As you might be aware, you might just be able to hear me. Unfortunately, the fire alarm is going off at probably the most inopportune time ever. So you might have to bear with me. It's not quite gone off yet, which is slightly concerning. Bear, bear,
If I come to UK, I should be the right place, right? If you are not using the credit card in UK, that's okay. Or whatever you use in America or Asia, that's somewhere in Italy, they don't care. They don't care also for other countries.
we're still unfortunately still going, but I'm just going to try and move location for one moment. Apologies about this. Sorry everyone, sorry about this. Obviously not ideal. Still ongoing fire alarm in the building. I think that's all fine. It must be from another section of the building, but without much further ado, I'll get kicked off and try and be quick because we've lost a few moments. I'm Daniel. I'm the policy officer for the Co-operative Party. I'm really pleased to have you all join us here this evening. This year, the Co-operative Party's policy process will be focusing on international development and also health policy. With the abolition of the Department for International Development and the cut to foreign aid from the UK's budget, going down from 0.7% to 0.5%, the party felt it was really vital to review our international development policy. Our policy process is member-led, and we really want to hear from all our members and party branches. Tonight, we want to encourage submissions to the policy process by having our expert speakers discuss the issues international development currently faces. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to start with a few tips on how we can make this more interactive for everyone. Firstly, for those who are hard of hearing, we are working with the RNID to live caption this event. If you want to view these captions, you will need to enable them yourself by pressing the CC icon on the bottom tools panel of your phone or computer. This Zoom call is being recorded as many of our members cannot join live. As it's going to go up on the Co-operative Party's YouTube channel, if you don't want your image seen, please remove yourself from video and go to audio only. In order to prevent disruptions, only those speaking will have their sound enabled. After tonight's speakers, we're going to hold a Q&A session where you can ask questions in two ways. You can post your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your virtual hand and we'll come to you when it's your time to speak. Finally, please bear in mind the co-operative values and principles when contributing, so we can make sure all members feel safe, welcome and respected. Now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, David Taylor, who is the founder of the Labour Campaign for International Development. I would also like to introduce Louise Harbour, who is the field organiser at the Aid Alliance. And just to say, unfortunately, Emily Pearce of the Co-operative Group is no longer able to join us. So I'll pass over to David. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Daniel, and it's great to see so many of you on the call. So I really appreciate you guys being here. It's great from Labour Campaign for International Development perspective to be able to continue our work and engagement with the Co-op Party. Also great to see Louise on the call. I do a lot with the Aid Alliance as well, in both in my day job and LSID, trying to support the efforts they're doing to protect our aid budget. Daniel asked me to talk a bit about the recently published International Development Strategy, but I'm going to sort of speak a bit wider, if you don't mind, Daniel, because I think that really our focus as a co-op party, and I'm a member of the Co-op Party myself, is really to help equip the next Labour and cooperative government with the best policies possible. So to some extent, the Tories are going to create a lot of damage over the coming years, but really we need to be focused on what it is that we would do when we next have the chance to make a difference in government. And there's three things that I am going to briefly touch on. Any of you, I don't know if any of you were at the Progressive Britain conference the other weekend, but there was a good session on global politics there, and my old boss, a mentor, Kirsty McNeil, gave a talk. So this is borrowing quite heavily on what she said, but I'm a firm believer in message discipline, so I make no apologies for repeating the same message. But the thing she thinks that we need to focus on, and I agree, and we do at ELSID, is three M's, and that's mission, money, and ministers. And I'll just briefly talk about all three and what we mean by that. Mission. When we set up DFID in government and when we passed the International Development Act of 2002, we made the mission of international development ending extreme poverty. That was the focus of all international development spending and action in government. And that's because we had come in 1997 after a Conservative government that had diverted the aid budget in a number of ways. Some of you might remember something called the Perga Dam scandal, which was a dam in Malaysia where we had offered, as the British government, to pay for that dam if the Malaysians bought weapons from us. That's exactly the kind of tied aid that we absolutely don't want to see. And that happens when you don't have a clear sense of what your mission is. And the mission should always be, what are the ways in which we can help alleviate extreme poverty? It isn't just about aid, it's not just about one department, it's about a cross-government approach. You don't need me to tell you as Co-op Party members the importance of trade and fair trade. There's obviously work that can be done from a humanitarian point of view to help protect civilians from being killed by dictators, just as we did in Kosovo. And there are action that we can do on climate change. There's also stuff that we can do on debt relief. And Gordon Brown, who's Chancellor, really did push that through to ensure that we were tackling debt relief and tax as well. But that mission has to be at the heart of what we do. The second thing is money. And Louise might talk about this a bit more, but obviously we've seen the terrible cut in aid. Co-op Party members were part of a petition and campaigning around this and continue to be really important in that. There is a worry that 0.5 is not the lowest point. You know, it could get worse. We'll have to see. You can never trust what the Tories are going to do with the aid budget. When Labour came in 1997, it was 0.2%. So you have to be conscious it's not the floor. Money matters because the more money you have, as long as you spend it well, and we did when we were in government, aid money under the UK government, under Labour, was some of the best spent taxpayers' money there was. When it is spent well, it changes lives. And it is just indisputable that if you cut the aid budget, you will risk hundreds of thousands of people suffering, many dying, because you are scaling back on the things, on what would otherwise be life-saving aid. And it is an absolute scandal that in the middle of the COVID pandemic, that's when the Tories chose to cut the aid budget completely unnecessarily. As poverty around the world has gone up because of that pandemic, that was the moment the UK government chose to cut it. So absolutely, any future strategy on international development has to have getting the aid budget up to 0.7 at the heart. And then the final thing is ministers, because it might seem like a technical point, but how you structure your government is really important. And it's aligned to that mission, but you have to have a team of civil servants and ministers who are there to deliver on that mission and on that agenda. And that means an independent department for international development. Now, the Tories have cut that, as we know. It has been over a year or more than that since that change was made, and yet the department's still in chaos. It's very difficult to see what they're trying to do. They've made an attempt at it with this international development strategy, but there's still not much joined up thinking within government and quite a lot of turnover of staff as well. It is not the game-changing, highly efficient government department that we had under DFID that we left to the Tories in 2010. So it's absolutely imperative that when we're next back in government, we have an independent department. Keir Starmer, the day that DFID was cut, pledged that Labour would do that. He's kept Preet Gill in the shadow cabinet, which is welcome. We do need to keep making the case within the Cooperative Party and within the Labour movement for that independent department. So that's the final thing I wanted to say on those three things. I mean, just to end, the international development strategy the government have come up with, it just doesn't meet the three criteria that I've set out. It is not clear enough on its mission. The money has been scaled back, and this department, as I said, is in chaos, and it's just not clear how they're going to deliver on even the rather modest strategy that they've set out and the goals they've set out. So yeah, that's a start of the 10 from me, and I'd love to hear what you guys think.
Thank you very much, David, for that really interesting presentation. I'm going to pass on now to Louise, who can speak for up to 10 minutes, and then we'll be opening on the floor to our members, who I'm sure have lots of questions for both of you.
Hi everyone. Okay, thanks for that, David. I think you set that out really well, actually, and stole half of my presentation, but that's fine. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you've just said there. I think the mission has been lost as to what this is for, and the international development strategy just reinforces that. Really, we're going back to sort of that aid for trade mentality again. It's really important that overseas development assistance is spent in the right places, and on it goes a long way in tackling the UN's sustainable development goals as well. It needs to go where the greatest need is, and the new international development strategy seems to focus on an almost trickle down economics model, which we know here never worked for us. So yeah, really important that that's scrutinised over the next couple of months. But you're right, the next Labour government are going to have to do something really drastic and reverse these, but also make it better, because it was never always fit for purpose, but it was definitely in a much better place than we have now. Obviously last year the government cut by 4.3 billion. So just to give you a bit of background about myself and how I came into the role of what I do, I worked on a DFID programme, so I worked under DFID, funded by them, for the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine and International Development, and I was made redundant as a result of the cuts. But when we talk about DFID as an independent department, it was such a well-respected department, and one of the few actually of government departments that worked really well. A lot of people say, there's not enough scrutiny around how it was spent, it wasn't in the right places. There was an awful lot of accountability in DFID. We counted biros, it was every penny was accounted for, and every part of that machine worked really well. And it was also well respected within the countries. People were clamouring to work with us, and it was almost like a flak jacket when you were out there as well. It was so respected within the communities, because it was really hitting the people where it was needed. So with Aid Alliance, we were set up in 2015 after the International Development Act in 2015 to defend the 0.7% in aid spending. Obviously now we're fighting to get that back. But we're also trying to raise awareness within communities about the public perceptions on aid and development, and just how intrinsically linked it is actually with our own health, well-being, even our own economy. So we're campaigning to reinstate DFID. So we're looking to get the 0.7% spend back up again. And the way that we do that is we work in local areas with local groups, and we try and galvanise those groups to make sure we're getting that public support and enabling them to gently lobby their decision makers. So I don't know if any of you followed the Nationality and Borders Bill, for example, which is part of what we've been doing over the last couple of months. There was a 60 MP rebellion in that, and Aid Alliance was really key in getting that rebellion to happen. Obviously, with such a large majority, we didn't succeed in not having the bill pass, but we are making those inroads. We champion international development, like I say, not just for the good it does around the world, which I've seen firsthand as an international development worker, but domestically too, highlighting the importance of aid and development and the wider implications of things like climate change and displacement of people. So there really does need to be a huge focus on this. We've already got, you know, a climate crisis on our hands. We've got refugee crises, conflicts arising all around the world. And ODA money goes a long way to helping to resolve those issues before actually them issues widen across borders. You know, the new international development strategy goes back to this less global outlook, you know, looking to reduce our work with multilaterals and go for more bilateral approach. It feels like, again, we'll start to look inwards. So the work that we do is to make sure that we get that public perception change, then people have them conversations, make people see the importance of international aid and development and just how it's all connected. But also, you know, people always say campaigners bring ideas, but politicians make things happen. So while we can all do our bit in our day-to-day lives, promoting that within our local communities and getting a community voice behind it and getting public support for it is so important. So we work down there on the grassroots levels to sort of make that happen. So that's just a little bit about us. And yeah, if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Louise. That's brilliant, and gives us plenty of time for Q&A questions. So I'll open up to our members on the call. Please do raise your hand or put it in the text box, the chat box, and we'll pick up your questions there. But is there anyone who'd like to go first, asking their questions to Louise and David? Yes, I see Bala now. Would you like to come in? Are you able to unmute him, Joel?
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for giving me the chance of saying something. It has been concerning me for quite some time. My son is an aid worker. He's worked for a variety of organizations. There are two things that he and I were during our discussions are thinking about. First of all, as an aid worker at the front end, he says that in a lot of cases, the people who distribute the aid are not humanitarian people. They don't have much experience in actual humanitarian stuff. They are organizers and distributors and don't understand humanitarian aid. A second point that I'm trying to find out is one of the most important things that's going to need aid is climate change. And there has been because the next migration is going to be because of climate change. And even when we look after conflicts, the conflict situation is exacerbated by climate change. So climate change has a big effect on most of our social conditions, and we have to guard ourselves for what's going to happen with migration especially. Now, there has been a sort of suggestion made by an organization that all rich countries or those who can afford it put money away for climate change problems and actually target those areas which have suffered climate change and start giving them alternatives, etc., and do whatever is needed to start affecting climate change. So what they're saying is the nature of international development needs to change in the kind of way it targets its funds, and that because of climate change, we need to concentrate quite significantly on those areas in the world which are seriously affected by climate change and have existence farmers. Thank you very much for the chance of talking.
Thank you very much, Bala. Thank you. I'm just going to pass on to Ramsey now, and then we'll take both your questions combined and pass over to David and Louise again.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm audible at the moment. I've got quite a few things I could say, but I've just got a couple of main points I start with. One is that it's absolutely correct to point to how impressive DFID became as an organization. as it was built up by Clare Short. But I think we have to correct the historical record a little bit. The demise in DFID as a force that it once had become was also under a Labour government when, I think from Hilary Benn's time onwards, you increasingly saw a slip from it having a razor-sharp focus on poverty internationally to cozying up to becoming a bit more of a foreign policy type department. And there was a strange symbiosis taking place. It starts slowly, but it became a long, slow, slippery slide. In terms of volumes of money, well, it's obvious that it's a question of how well spent that money is, and a lot of that is to do with how focused an international agency is in this matter. And I spent years working for an NGO, well, Oxfam, and then various UN organizations in development, particularly in the Middle East. And this odd increasing interrelationship between aid and foreign policy, I think was the bane of our lives. But also in terms of the economy of aid agencies, it isn't just the volume of money that is important. And I say that because in many ways, the money that became available had a distorting effect on the processes within our major non-governmental aid agencies. I remember after the Great Lakes crisis in Africa and the genocide taking place in Rwanda, all the knowledge that had been built up on aid agencies' desks in terms of what was happening in the Great Lakes area was swept aside by the focus on humanitarian as opposed to development work. In my time, quite often it was the development workers leading the process of understanding the humanitarian needs, with specialists being brought in to deliver on the technical aspects of aid delivery, whether it be in logistics, engineering, and various other areas. That was swept aside, and I can still remember a number of so-called humanitarian workers running around corridors shouting, "Development is dead." It all became about massive relief. And in turn, that's where the budgets were. And I think a lot of our aid agencies started to be seduced by the money that was available for international aid and their own burgeoning income, which became focused on humanitarian activities, in many cases, not always well thought out and well spent. And it's an open secret that many of the mistakes made probably led to many lives being lost, as opposed to lives being saved, with the imperatives that were there with people who did not understand the local conditions and the local actors as well as they should have done. So I just wanted to throw that in at this stage. There are various aspects to it, but I would not be entirely comfortable with the notion that we simply resurrect DFID. I believe it is necessary, but I think there's a huge difference between the organization that grew up under Clare Short and what increasingly followed. And I think we have to be wary of understanding all the lessons that are locked up in there. Thank you for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramsey. I'm going to pass back to David and Louise now. I don't know who wants to come in first to respond to both Bala and Ramsey's points.
Sure. Louise, do you want to go first or do you want me to go first?
No, go ahead, David. You took yourself off mute. It's fine.
Yeah, no, thanks both for your points. I'll sort of take them both in one go, if that's okay. And if you don't feel like I've answered properly, then I'll happily come back to it. Look, I mean, not for a moment suggesting that the department you create in the next Labour government is the same as the one we created in 1997. I think it's more about having a clear demand of Labour Party policy and of the Conservative government that does happen, that there is an independent department. And I certainly agree that when you come to how you spend that money, it's on a range of different things, right? I mean, LSID has a number of priorities that we push. I mean, development aid, we have consistently called for more and more money to be spent through, well, not more and more money, but a high level of money to be spent on health and education, supporting governments to build health and education systems, universal healthcare, free schooling, high quality education, high quality healthcare. Build it so these countries are not just dependent on individual aid projects, but rather we're helping a government to build their own public services. And there are obviously examples of where that's been done well and where it has been done less well. But there's some good examples of how aid, for example, to Sierra Leone helped get rid of some of the healthcare fees that people are having to pay, and it instantly helped promote universal healthcare in that country. I'll come to climate change in a moment, but yes, of course, there has to be a high proportion going to respond to humanitarian crises. And this year, we're going to have we're already having a huge problem on hunger, partly as a result of the Ukrainian conflict and Russia's illegal invasion that's just destroying one of the breadbasket of the world. There also has to be a balance, though, as you say, Ramsey, about how much you're spending on humanitarian aid versus how much you're spending on development projects. And so I do agree with you on that. There's also things like aid for trade. So tide aid is one thing, but aid that actually facilitates small, particularly the poorest farmers and workers, to get their goods to market and to get export their goods, if that's appropriate to the UK, it also has a role. So if you look back at the white paper that Labour published in, I think it was 2009, that was, to me, a department that had a range of different priorities, and I think that's absolutely right. And one of them has to be, of course, climate change. We, in my day job, I work for Fair Trade. We had farmers over from different countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America for the climate talks in Glasgow last year. And one of them, a guy called Bismarck, a cocoa farmer in Ghana, told me that, I was texting him on WhatsApp when he got back, and he said that he got home from his climate talks back to his village, and he could see the problems already happening because of climate change. He came back to some really irregular weather patterns for that time of the year, which put his future crop at risk. So absolutely, there has to be a focus on climate change, and it should be the kind of interventions that are helping people both adapt to climate change, but also to shift to the low carbon production as well.
Louise, would you like to come in on any further points there?
Just very briefly, because David has covered a lot of the points there, but so things like the health delivery programmes, one of the first things that went when the government did the 4.3 billion worth of cuts last year was health delivery programmes. And at the time, we were told that they weren't looking to return to those as well. But, you know, some of the effects that had on the programme I worked on in particular, we used to do hydrocele surgeries for gentlemen who had been subject to lymphatic filariasis. It was a $20 operation that they could have, which ensured that they could provide for the family. And I'm hearing stories now, a year later, from contacts that I've got in DRC, that, you know, some of these families haven't been able to go back to work. Children have been pulled out of school to have to go and work in these rural areas to support the families. So the health delivery programmes obviously is a passion of mine, but that's one of the ones I'm really sad to see go. That's where I feel like the money should be targeted, especially on the back of a global pandemic, when we've seen how public health, you know, it's not restricted to borders anymore. The world's far too small for that. So things like public health programmes, education, I couldn't agree more with David on education, definitely. But you do have to have that balance, like you say, trying to stimulate economies for rural farmers, or getting areas to be more self-sustaining. The programme I worked on was the Ascend programme, and that was very, very focused on capacity building in those countries and building that infrastructure. That was closed down a year from its end date. So when we talk about effective spending, it's 2 years, and we were, you know, we could see the finish line, and some of these organisations and people working within country would have been able to sort of take that forward, and we would have been able to move out and move on to another area and do what needed doing there. So when we talk about the waste of money, when I see some of the programmes that were so close to the end and so close to completing, to save 4.3 billion, which is an awful lot to you and I, it just seems a bit futile. And then going onto the climate change issue, this is one of the things I go on about all the time. You know, Madagascar currently is having the first famine that can be completely attributed to climate change and no other conflict. And it's going to be the biggest driver for the next refugee crisis that we see, the next mass migration that we see, and also forcing people into towns, cities, where people are going to be fighting for resources, which could create future conflict. So they're the two areas for me: the public health, the education, and climate as well. Those are the areas for me where this should really be targeted if we want to make the most impact.
Thank you very much, Louise, for that great answer. I'm just going to take 3 more additional questions now as well, and then pass back to David and Louise again. So I've got the first one, which came in, was Philip in the chat, which was what assistance can be given to water aid. Also, I saw Jean-Roger provided a rather extensive and very good a question, and I'll just ask him if you wouldn't mind unmuting and asking, you know, which of those questions would you be most keen to have David and Louise answer. So it would be great to hear from you, Jean-Roger, if you'd be happy. Okay, no problem at all. Well, I think one of the most pertinent ones Jean-Roger asked was how important and how much awareness is there of the Millennium Development Goals from the UN. So how can we make sure those UN development goals are really front and center going forward? And then finally, Dennis, I see you've had your hand up for a while as well. So please, I'll take you off mute.
Are you inviting me to speak now or after the two?
Please do.
I'm joining this conversation as a newcomer, in a sense, although I have contributed to the conversations on the topic elsewhere. What I'm so surprised about is that the discussion, although I appreciate everything that's been said, is not really saying very much about it being the cooperative party or about the role of cooperatives in a distinctive way within international development. And I think it's important that we address the issues from the point of view of our own special background. I could comment extensively because I have 50, 60 years experience of working in development on all of the issues which other people are commenting on. But I think that we really need to concentrate on what it is that the cooperative party has to contribute to this debate on international development and how it should be delivered. That is distinctive to us. I will just refer briefly, however, to a comment made about the DFID under Claire Short. I remember meeting her at UNESCO one time, a long time ago when she was still minister, and discussing some things with her. But under Claire Short, one of the things we launched, which is relevant to what other people have said, is a scheme for extending what were development education centres. And in my case, I was associated with the one on Teesside, and she provided with budgets to extend our development education activities to the whole of the Northeast. And similar activities took place in other regions of the UK. Again, usually starting from some existing one which had been operating largely on voluntary funds earlier. Now, I think that has died, but I think that is the kind of thing the Cooperative Party could encourage, and particularly encourage in a way in which Cooperative Party members could be part of that activity along with other agencies that are relevant, like the DEA, which is the Development Education Association, the International Science Education Group, and others, where there is a real possibility of having cooperative activity, both locally here in the UK and on the ground in the developing countries, based on a cooperative model. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I'll pass back to Louise now first, and then David to respond to that. But yeah, it would be fantastic if we could hear from both of you, as Dennis rightly points out, was my main question: how can cooperatives take a more active role in international development?
Okay, so there's a few questions that come in then, but yeah, I'll deal with that one first. So with the cooperative, I mean, obviously the purpose of this type of event is to talk about international development from the, different people who are dealing with it around the UK, and to develop those policies with the members. But obviously the cooperative already does a lot, I think, for international development, and the fair trade programs that we do across the world. But obviously it's about it's okay as having these policies, but we've got to sell them. So obviously I'm going to say from my perspective, from Aid Alliance, where I work with grassroots, about, you know, communicating this to communities, making sure that people can really get behind international development as a concept first. We've got a lot of noise to cut through at the moment. We've got a cost of living crisis to deal with. It's very difficult. I go out on street stalls and speak with members of the public all the time who will say, you know, well, we've got enough to be dealing with here. And quite frankly, they're right, we have got enough to be dealing with here. But, you know, the people always forget that the quote is charity begins at home, but it doesn't have to end there. And it's getting that message out. So I think just the fact that the cooperative are focusing on this as a policy development idea for this year is a really good start, and to build on the work that they already do. But it's about changing those public perceptions and getting people behind us, because if politicians feel like it's not going to be a vote winner for them, if politicians feel like we're not going to hold them to account on the decisions they make on international development, then they will ride roughshod over, you know, whatever they want to do. So I think that's the main thing at the moment. Just the fact that we're having this conversation is a really good start.
Fantastic. David, would you like to come back on the questions from Dennis, also from Jean-Roger and Philip?
Yeah, great, thank you. I agree with what Louise has just said. I'll just very quickly run through the three. So on Philip's question about water aid, yes, absolutely, water and sanitation is absolutely crucial. Again, this is another thing that we had a good track record on when we were last in government. I will see if I can bring up the stats, but I'm sure that there's a little killer fact that we used to have about what we had done on water and sanitation. But yeah, 1.5 million people between 1997 and 2010 were helped with improved wash services. So, you know, it's clearly a really important thing to do. John Rogers' question, I think, was really about sustainable business, if I read it right. And speaking with the sort of work hat on with Fair Trade, obviously we work with a number of businesses who are trying to do the right thing by paying farmers and workers better prices for the things that they produce. At the COP last year, there were a number of companies that made pledges around sustainability and tackling climate change. So I think there is a willingness within business to tackle some of the problems around sustainability, both from a poverty point of view and from a climate point of view. I think there always needs to be a carrot and stick approach. So I think as much as possible, there's a role to boost those companies that want to do the right thing. There are ways in which you could use aid, for example, to help facilitate the setting up of initiatives that bring together governments and businesses and farmers and workers for shared outcomes. I think there's also a stick approach, and the right kind of regulation is important. For example, around ensuring there's this concept called human rights and due diligence, which I always struggle to explain, to be honest. I still don't quite understand it myself, but it's essentially around regulation, ensuring that you compel businesses to take responsibility for their own supply chains. Deforestation is clearly one example of that, but you have to do it the right way. So I think it's right that we say to companies, you must ensure that products come into the UK and not from deforested land. But at the same time, you've got to make sure that they are not then pushing those new regulations onto the farmers, because to monitor whether a product comes from deforested land or not, you need certain, it comes with certain costs, and it should be on the company to be responsible for that monitoring and not on the individual farmer or cooperative. And cooperatives leads me to your point, Dennis. I mean, absolutely, and apologies for not bringing this out more in my remarks. I would say this, wouldn't I? But I do think that fair trade is a great example of the sort of aid that you can do in a really cooperative way. There were so many cooperatives around the world that need extra support to ensure that their members are able to have living incomes, to become more productive, to ensure that there are decent public services in their community. And there's clearly a role, in my view, for aid to help boost cooperatives around the world. And actually, that is something that would be of interest to members. I think it'd be really great if the cooperative party was developing some of those ideas and putting forward some, whether it's principles or ideas for good practice, the type of projects that we should be supporting when we next have a Labour government. I think that would be really good.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. Dennis, did you want to come back on something? Because unless you didn't, I have a question for both David and Louise as well.
Well, you ask your question and then I'll come back.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask both David and Louise, with the pandemic and what's happened throughout the world in terms of the vaccine apartheid and obviously the Omicron variant emerging from what was at the time a relatively low level of vaccine uptake in South Africa due to the lack of vaccines. How can we ensure going forward that our development provides greater medicines and really takes into account these global inequalities on health? So how can we ensure that our international development strategy for the Cooperative Party encompasses that? And would you like to come in, Dennis, and then we'll go back to Louise and David?
Okay. I think one of the things I'd like to emphasize is that on a lot of the issues that people are raising, there are already existing organizations, such in the case of science education, for example, the Association of Science Education, which is a vast number of teachers in the UK, who are all very highly motivated. And in the past, at least, when we had the encouragement from Claire Short, did actively involve themselves in this kind of thing. Also, in the University of Loughborough, we have the WEDEC Research Centre, which has done great work on sanitation and water. And so the point I'm making here is that what the cooperative and the Cooperative Party needs to do is to seek out these organizations who are already specialists in those areas. And that also includes people who are looking at legislation and good practice for private companies, and to get together with them and form alliances to deliver these things rather than trying to invent the wheel themselves. And that the vehicle, one of the main vehicles to do that is the Cooperative College, which already has extensive contacts. The conference they had a year or two back to celebrate their 100th anniversary was the most impressive thing that I've been to possibly in my career, and that was held in Rochdale. So I think we have that vehicle. I think we can support that vehicle. And I think that they, along with Fair Trade and WEA, for example, could help us to make more contact at the local level. So, I mean, I've been involved with both of those organizations, but although there are individuals who are involved across the board, there isn't, as far as I know, any organized collaboration process between such organizations.
Thank you, Dennis. I'll pass back to Louise and David now. So, Louise, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, I can come in on that, the point on vaccines, which you asked. So again, you know, the vaccine programme, obviously we saw the government inflated that cost and then added that to the aid bill as well, rather than it being a separate one, so somewhere else it was getting cut. But one of the things that occurred to me on the programme that I was on, we used to do a lot of integrated mass drug administrations as well, which kept costs extremely low, as most medications are donated. If you've already got that infrastructure there delivering for one tropical disease, then, you know, we'd sometimes administer them for 2 or 3 at the same time, and the cost was minimal. With the cuts that have happened now, actually that infrastructure is now lost. So all of the health centres and things we had set up in rural areas across like DRC or Mozambique, they've already been lost. So again, it's going back to what we had. We had a cooperative approach. And I think, you know, again, pushing to get that aid budget back up to where it should be, pushing for the Department for International Development to be independent department in its own right. It's been absolutely catastrophic since the amalgamation into FCDO. They're not the right resources in there, not the right people in the right places, and not enough focus. such a huge task. We've just been talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, these 17 huge goals that we were supposed to achieve by 2030. That needs to have a department its own right looking at it. So again, it's going back to that cooperative approach and seeing where we can work with other agencies to help deliver that vaccine, but also pushing on the government to make sure that's not included as aid in the midst of a pandemic, because we are still in the midst of a global pandemic. So I think pushing for that would be key, but pushing for that joint working as well. So working with other agencies like the School of Tropical Medicine, working with SCI, the Wellcome Trust, Crown agents, and keeping the costs low and making sure that we can deliver to the people that really need it most.
Thank you, Louise. David, would you like to come in here?
Sorry, I think that the connection went slightly when some of the questions were being asked, Daniel. Do you mind just repeating again?
Yeah, I was just asking a question on how we can make sure something like the vaccine apartheid would never happen again, and how can we make sure international development achieves better, reduces our health inequalities which are across the globe.
Well, our leadership really, and having the right government in place at the right time. I mean, I just think it's inconceivable that if you'd had a Labour government in place at the time that the pandemic hit, you would have seen the same scale of problems. I don't doubt it would have been difficult at home and abroad. But if you think back to the 2009 financial crisis, Gordon Brown, he got mocked if he slipped his tongue in Prime Minister's questions about saving the world, but he kind of did. Like we stopped a recession turning into a depression. We had a London summit that really did bring the world together with a package of reforms that helped ensure that the global economy got moving again. And by the way, he also ensured that there were the right measures in place to help ensure that developing countries, lower income countries that weren't part of the G20 were not forgotten. So I just think that if we had been in government when the pandemic hit, we would have had a much better approach. And you can see that in the fact with what Gordon has been doing and the advocacy he's been doing during the pandemic, and he's been relentless in working with the WHO to try and, as you say, address the vaccine apartheid. So I just don't think it's that difficult, if I'm honest. I think we know the answers to, like, you have a summit, you knock heads together, you raise the appropriate funds. It's not actually rocket science. Like, we could have been getting vaccines to more people faster. And instead, we have Boris Johnson and Sunak doing the things that they're doing. It's just, it makes me very angry because, we've seen the things that have happened. And of course, it's not just about vaccines, is it? Because one of the things that we saw was the impact of lockdowns, both our lockdowns and lockdowns that other countries brought in. And I'll just very quickly say what I mean. When there was all the supermarket panic buying, supermarkets rationed what they were doing. And it meant that certain lines got dropped. So if you were a Kenyan flower farmer, suddenly you weren't finding a market for the flowers that you sell, because now, quite understandably, Sainsbury's or whatever was saying, okay, we're going to focus on toilet roll. But that did have a knock-on effect. So there is an effect of lockdowns. The other thing, of course, is that a lot of countries didn't have a furlough scheme in a way that we did. And I'm defending that I think it could have been better here, of course, but some countries just didn't have that. So when you shut down the economy, that means that people just literally don't have a job. So there's secondary things that you could have done to help ensure that people had some kind of basic welfare through this time. But yeah, for me, it just comes down to leadership. Where there's a will, there's a way.
Thank you very much, David. And I'm just going to take one final question, just in the interest of time, so we can finish on time at 7 p.m. Chris, would you like to come in now?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this talk as well from Louise and David. So my question is around education and its role in DFID and also internal aid. How do you see that playing a role? Because we have discussed a lot about climate change and poverty alleviation. How about education as well? as a lever.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I'll just ask Louise and David just to keep your answers reasonably brief, just so we can finish up on time. Thank you.
Yeah, I can be really brief on that. I mean, yeah, education are really another, key part of international development. And this is one of the things that worries me with the new international development strategy is, we put education programs in some countries where actually governments would prefer people would not be educated in those countries. And when we start looking at the new international development strategy and the way the money's going to be spent and this trickle down effect, and it's all about the economy and trade, that really does worry me. Over the last 10 years, I think it's about 4 million children in Africa alone that have attended school, being able to get an education, down to ODA spend. It's a huge thing, and that's where it all begins. And that's why I talk about health, keeping people healthy and able to work, and education, making sure the children can go to school, get their education, and have other opportunities beyond the realms of what they're already in. But if you don't have it's a key piece. It's a puzzle, and all of the pieces have to be in place. Education and health are the two main things. So yeah, there really needs to be a focus on that. And I'm glad to see in the international development strategy there's going to be a focus on women and girls. The difficulty with the international development strategy is there's a lot of high level stuff there, but there's very little detail. There's a lot of what we're going to do, but there's no how at the moment. And I'm hoping over the next few months we'll be able to tease that out. But I really hope that that's where the focus will be, on health and education.
Yeah, I agree again. I think that there needs to be a focus on education on both the quantity and the quality of it. So what I mean by that is that there have been, thanks to aid, some quite significant progress made over the last 20 years or more on global education. So when we next have a Labour and cooperative government, it's not going to be quite the same challenge. We've done a really good job on primary school education. The question is now, how can you equip people to have a proper secondary education? We've addressed things around the fees that people often have had to pay, although I'm not up to date on the latest, so maybe fees have crept back in as an issue, but free education was a big challenge. I think we've made some big strides on that, but we've also got to make sure that the education is being taught at a decent quality, that we have decent teachers in schools, ensuring that people are well equipped. And then the final thing is that there are certain situations where, like conflict zones, where education is extremely important, and you need to have education in emergencies, as it were, to ensure that the kids aren't missing out on education. You take somewhere like Syria, you've had refugees stuck in camps for over a decade now. That's someone's entire education. If you're not careful, you have to ensure that whenever there is a disaster, whether it's man-made or natural, and people are displaced, that you have decent quality education for the kids that are in exile.
Thank you very much, David. Just in the interests of time, I'm going to wrap up now and just say a few things. But just before I do that, I'm just going to pass over just for 1 minute to both David and Louise, just to see if you've got any final concluding remarks.
I'd just like to say, thank you very much for having me, and a really great conversation. Like I said before, I'm really pleased that this is going to be a focus for the cooperative over the next year. And if anyone wants to find out more, there's other resources on the Bond website where there's some really digestible articles pulling apart the international development strategy and other things, which make a nice simple read. Also follow DevEx as well to see the effects of the cuts, the Aid Alliance website, and the One Campaign have got a great resource at the moment as well about how aid is being distributed since the cuts. It's an absolute passion of mine, so I could sit and talk about it all day long. But there's some really good resources if you want some good digestible information. Well, thank you very much for having me, and I hope the policy writing goes well.
Thank you very much, Louise. David?
Just to support the work that Louise is doing with the Aid Alliance and the work that the cooperative party has been doing around this 0.7 issue is the thing that's in front of us the most at the moment. So I think if you, particularly if you live in an area with a Conservative MP at the moment, then do please consider the ways in which you can help by writing to your MP, making the case for aid to go back to 0.7 as soon as possible. You know, as Louise said, we tried our best to win a vote in Parliament on this issue. We weren't successful, largely because a bunch of Tory MPs told us one thing and then did another. But we might get another opportunity to bring a vote before the end of this Parliament on this. So look out and don't think that your email or letter won't make a difference, because it just might. It just might tip the balance. So and then finally, you know, we talked a lot about cooperative ideas. Dennis has said that needs to be our focus. I think that's right. Daniel's going to be leading a policy process. I think it's absolutely right that we're contributing as many ideas as we can to the policy side of things as well.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you both to both our speakers this evening. It's been really fantastic conversation. And thank you all for joining us this evening and making it a really enjoyable session. Just to let you know, the next week we'll be hosting a Cooperation Live event on health policy. So we'd be delighted if we could see as many of you join for that. And also just one final thing to say, which is we really want you to respond to the policy process. We're very keen to hear from all our members and also all our party branches. So you can find details of that on our website at party.coop/policy/2022. So please do respond to that if you haven't already. And we're always here at Cooperative Party HQ if you've got any questions or need any advice on anything. But once again, thank you much to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.